In future courses, we'll be investigating ways of accessing different structures within the brain. So this is by diffusing and balancing particular nuclei within the brain, we can support the client to resolve emotional stress. So, a big part of what we do in kinesiology is actually identifying regions of the brain that are stressed and then releasing the stress out of that region of the brain. And that can make a big difference in how we process emotion. So in the beginning of the second semester, we do the neurophys course, and we start to learn how to isolate some key structures in the brain to resolve stress. And that can really start to make changes for people. So, and you've already sampled that a bit, like when things aren't working and we get like one of those vials, and put the vial in again, things start working again. So that's just part of your brain seizing up. And you just get the vial, and the vial helps that part of the brain start working properly, supports it. And then your brain function increases and weird things stop happening in the kinesiology because your brain's working better. So our triggers for emotional stress can sit in parts of the brain which are controlled by the subconscious or unconscious. Because kinesiology can directly access hidden parts of the brain, it is especially effective for a wide range of issues involving neurological stress. So one of the problems with a lot of our disorders that we can have emotionally, neurologically, is that they're actually subconscious triggers, and when we try and deal with them through sort of cognitive type processes where we're doing sort of counselling and psychotherapy and what have you, often we don't get to where we need to get to make a difference because the parts that are causing the problem are sitting at another level, and we're fishing around on the surface level but can't actually access the lower parts. And so then that creates a really strong case for medication. So then a lot of people, who have different disorders will get medicated because a lot of the time just, psychotherapy, A, it takes a very long time to get results, and B, sometimes it never gets to the parts that need to be accessed. So by actually locating different parts of the brain that are relating to that stress, we set a goal, and then this part of the brain shows up in relation to the goal, which is offsetting the issue, and we release stress out of that part of the brain. Often the symptoms dissipate rapidly. There's a lady who I bump into at Mind Body Spirit festivals every now and again. She did a little bit of study with the college many years ago, and she came in with, she was getting panic attacks, 5 or 6 times a week, and had done for the last 5 years. And we just had one session, released stress out of the brain, and she was very disoriented. She sat in the clinic all day because she didn't feel up to driving. She just sitting in the chair in the clinic. And then she went home, and then, when I see it in Mind Body Spirit, I said, it's been 10 years, I haven't had a panic attack since. And she was getting 6 times a week, and it was just one treatment. And that's not unusual. That happens quite frequently to people. Sometimes people, there's a lady, a young lady, she's like 20 or something, who I've been working with, had panic attacks and high anxiety for a long time. And after 3 treatments, she went off her meds and wasn't getting panic attacks anymore. But she, her certain behavioural patterns in her life hadn't changed. So she would take on too much. And she would, drive herself too hard. And so then they'd start to come back again because she hasn't made structural changes to her life. So then the next phase of the process is, what she needs to look at to make sort of structural changes to the way she organises her life and what she prioritises on a daily basis for that to continue so she doesn't recreate it. But she's off the meds and if she didn't overload herself, she would be fine, but she has to work on that now.
How does clients on medication go?
Yeah, generally they improve.
But they don't have to be off medication.
No. Generally they improve. Like if people have I've noticed if people have migraines, and if they're having a migraine that day when they come to session, and they've taken large amounts of analgesic, that can affect it. But if they came on another day, A, they didn't have a migraine, and B, they weren't on analgesic, it probably would be better. Or if they had the migraine coming on but weren't on analgesic, that would be good, probably the best, because it showed the symptoms, showed the stuff up better. But yeah, people with antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications and what have you, they seem to improve quite nicely even while they're on it. Antipsychotics is another story. That's another whole other realm. So the brain can be divided into basic subunits. So this was a breakup by a neurophysiologist called Paul MacLean. And he sort of looked at 3 evolutionary levels of the brain. So the brainstem was the reptilian, the limbic was the paleomammalian, the primitive mammal, and then the cortex was the neomammalian, the more advanced new mammal. So these 3 parts of the brain represent evolutionary progression of vertebrates, where the brainstem is referred to as the reptilian brain, the limbic, the paleomammalian, and the cortex is the neomammalian. The limbic below is also considered the epicenter of our emotions. And in future courses, we'll be able to isolate and balance different components to improve the client's emotional modulation. Professor Krebs, who was here doing lectures last year, he's had a lot of success working with MRI brain results. So they've now profiled certain activity patterns in the brain with different types of disorders. So people will have this disorder, they go, this is what that shows up in the MRI. And that disorder, this is what shows up in the MRI. And it just shows that the activity of the brain is different when people have different disorders. And he's been trying to, he's already accumulated some evidence to show that you can get someone who's had long-term OCD that lights up in the MRI in a particular configuration, balance them, put them back in the MRI, and when they pop out, their brain configuration is normal in terms of the activity after the kinesiology. So that sort of could work, but MRI time's expensive, so you need a lot of money to do that sort of research, and no one really wants to put the money into it. And then we have different neuroemotional pathways in the brain that are linked to different response. So some neuroscientists have actually mapped which nuclei in the brain and in what sequence trigger certain responses. So we have the care pathways, the rage anger pathways, the panic pathways, fear, seeking, lust, play. So they're all different pathways that activate within the brain. So the problem with a lot of neuroscientists is they try not to have, because science is always tries to put things in the terms of it. So it's always the it, the third person. Tries to look at different objective thing. And that's flawed. It's when it's only that. And so because they're looking at it, they don't really concern with emotions. Emotions are more subjective and more concerned with the I, the you, not the it. So anyway, so emotions create significance in our capacity to remember. We tend to remember the events that we associate with extreme pleasure or extreme pain. From a survival perspective, this makes sense. We will want to avoid the pain and seek out that which is pleasurable. So memory is very closely linked to strong emotional experiences. So, strong pleasure that you've had in the past is memorable, and strong pain, emotional, physical pain is memorable as well. And that helps our survival. So, if we saw, we went down that part of the forest and we got, attacked by a bear. We narrowly escaped with our life. We kind of go, we don't go down that way. And then we went this way in the forest with a beautiful grove of fruit trees that have delicious fruit on them at certain times of year. Yeah, we like to go down there at this time because you remember eating the good fruit. But you also remember getting chased by a ravenous bear. So then I avoid this and I go for this, and that helps my survival. So those strong responses create strong memories as well. So emotion and memory are very interrelated. From an evolutionary perspective, emotions seem to be linked to social development. So the species may increase its survival capacity by forming groups such as herds, packs, prides, etc. The development of emotion creates cohesion within a species. Also, aggression between males selects out the strongest for mating, improving the gene pool. So, a lot of the emotional responses are there for reasons like in terms of survival. So in order to stay coherent as a group, the species require a great depth of emotion to bond and work together for survival. So fears and phobias. So this is something I had to put in because of the training package. All of those things are really touched on in here. So I'll let you read that on your own. So fear and phobias are just a definition of extreme irrational fear. That's treated in the same way that we treat everything in kinesiology. This next section on page 7 is about understanding emotional stress. So when we look at an emotional issue, we often just see part of the picture. Usually it is the distressing emotion that stands out. However, when we look deeper, there is an interlocking pattern of different emotions that take effect over time, forming a type of emotional cycle or pattern. So this is really important. So usually when you have some sort of emotional thing that sort of flares up from time to time, and is distressing, we often focus on the distressing element of it, but there's usually a cycle of interlocking emotions that feed into that one that flares up that we notice. So there's never just sort of one thing. There's always like a pattern, and then that interlocking pattern of emotional states all kind of cycle around and feed into each other. So it's just something to be aware of when we're doing kinesiology. So like for that young woman I was talking about who had anxiety, we could clear the anxiety, but there was a behavioural pattern that caused the anxiety to occur. So she was obviously very driven to perform, took on too much, and then would make herself have anxiety. And so if we just look at the anxiety, it's more of a symptom of something else. And so once we clear that, we can see that she's recreating because she's so driven. We're going to look at why she's so driven and look at the emotions behind that and clear those, so then she can start to balance her life more so she doesn't create anxiety. So the anxiety is more of a secondary effect to something else in terms of which is then linked to an emotion that makes her feel like she's got to perform perform excessively. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So then there's a pattern of interlocking things that are all feeding into each other to create the symptomatic. So she just goes, I've got anxiety, but she's also got other things that are causing anxiety. And if you just treat the anxiety, it's not enough. You need to treat things that are causing it. Does that make sense? So the charge is like intense emotional experience, the feeling of the emotion or the energy we're building up that appears to elicit the stress. So that could be the anxiety in that particular person. The pattern, this propensity for a set of emotions to recreate themselves in a sequence. The energy cycle of the emotion that reflects the nerve pathways that appear to run an emotion. So that'll relate to our series of neural networks as well that we engage and run that create situations where we get strong emotional responses, and we're stuck in that pattern of behaviour that causes that to emerge. Can anyone relate to that in your own life? No? So dissipating the charge can feel like a relief. However, it is not the primary goal of kinesiology, as the underlying pattern to recreate the charge states will often remain. So that's sort of where, like, I sometimes don't sort of over relish EFT and things like that, because that's focused on charge dissipation rather than looking at patterns. So you can release the charge, but often releasing the charge doesn't deal with the pattern. And that's why with kinesiology, with the muscle test, we always try and look for that deeper cause all the time. So negative emotion states feed other emotional states. Each state builds its charge or intensity until it changes form. Eventually, emotions sequentially recreate themselves, becoming a cycle pattern. So someone might have an anger outburst, and then they feel guilty, and then because they feel guilty because of the outburst, then they make amends. So they go, oh, I feel so bad. I'm going to do this for them, I'm going to do that for them, I'm going to do this, do that. And then they start to get resentful because they're doing all this shit for them. And then that resentment builds up and they have another outburst. And then they feel guilty again. Then they make amends. And they might be focusing on the anger. Go, oh my God, I have this terrible anger management problem. But maybe they need to look at, how they make amends for things. Maybe they need to look at how they release themselves from the guilt around the anger rather than the anger itself. And so if they release themselves from the guilt, then they have a more balanced way of building bridges with people after, so that they don't build up resentment, so they don't have an anger outburst. Does that make sense? So we're going to look a little bit more again about why we have emotional stress, and we talked about this last time. We're just sort of reviewing it to go deeper into it. We're going to incorporate some strategies on how to block emotional energy. So humans have evolved all of their emotions over millions of years. If any were detrimental to us as a species, evolution would have removed them by now. So the fact that we still have all of these emotions means that they are necessary, even though some may at times feel unpleasant. From my studies and research with kinesiology, our biggest dilemma with emotions is our resistance to certain emotions. Rather than allowing them to pass through us, we tend to block certain ones that we don't like, causing us to experience emotional stress. So it's the blocking of the energy and motion, the emotion, that causes the stress. So all human emotions are necessary. There is no bad emotions. The perception that emotion is not okay is the root cause of all our emotional stress. So when we go, this rage is bad, or this deep sadness is bad, or this grief is bad, or this guilt is bad, it's that judgment around that emotion not being okay that causes the the suffering or causes a lot to pass through us and then evolve to something else. So emotional stress has its origins in the following components. So we have trauma, judgment, and avoidance. So if we have a trauma, the trauma by the nature of the word means something unpleasant has happened and we feel injured by it. Would you agree? That would be a good sort of summation. So then, as long as we hold that framework of it being unpleasant and injured by it, that's our association with it. It's unpleasant, we're injured by it. And so naturally, we avoid it because of that association. So just like the bear in the cave down that way, I was nearly ripped apart by it. That was traumatic, so I don't go there anymore. So it keeps me alive in one way. But, if I was having, lots of recurring nightmares of the bear and things like that, then, it would be, then it might become like a big issue for me, rather than just being, I don't go down that way, but I have these recurring nightmares of this bear that just sort of plagues me. And then it's like, it's becoming an emotional issue, not just a circumstantial avoidance of a potentially dangerous situation, which enhances my survival. So, a trauma is signified as an event from our past. It can be understood as an experience which caused the generation of strong emotional charge, where at the time of occurrence we are unable to make sense of it, and consequently the emotional energy from the event has remained trapped in our body. It is a memory which is incomplete. The emotional charge is carried forward into the future. Even if the event is forgotten in our conscious memory, the charge can start to come to the surface again when a similar circumstance reoccurs in our life. During our childhood, our intellect is not developed, and our inability to understand why things are happening makes us vulnerable to collecting such traumas. So, just we don't understand when we're little, and so we just see strong emotions or unpleasant situations, and we don't understand the history of it. We don't understand why. We just get the tsunami of the event just pouring onto us, and we can't frame it in a way that makes sense for us. So judgment, by its own nature, an emotional trauma is always unpleasant. When an old trauma arises, the individual is always confronted with both intensity and unpleasant emotional energy. Consequently, the individual tends to both judge the situation and feelings that arise as being not okay, leading to some type of avoidance strategy to escape both the presenting feeling and the associated situation. Suppression and avoidance in kinesiology. So because we have judged the emotion and associated situations not being okay, then our first and strongest impulse is to avoid it in some way. When we are activated with a past trauma, we rarely consider that we are being re-stimulated from a past event. For all intents and purposes, it seems that we are dealing with something that's happening now, but in truth we're being dragged back into the past event. We are never upset for the reason that we think we are. So if this line is present time, and something's happening in present time that resembles something from the past so much completely, then the emotional energy from the past is activated. And I'm actually getting sucked back through a virtual wormhole into that other timeline. And so I'm kind of like crossing timelines. And so if I'm not very conscious of what's going on, I'll drag this story into the present and just act it out and actually make things worse. Because I'm not seeing that I've lost objectivity, I'm subjective to something that's happened in the past, I'm just bringing that forward into the present. Does that make sense?
Yeah, is that kind of also a little bit like when someone says to you, or someone says to another person, we always do this, or it could be the slightest thing, but you hear listen to like a couple of things being repeated. You know what I mean?
Well, that could be someone telling you that you're running a pattern test. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Sometimes that pisses you off and you say, so sometimes, you get triggered by those similar things. But what we want to try and do is, like when we feel ourselves get dragged back, we go, oh, I'm getting dragged back into a past event. I may not even be aware of what that past event is, but what we need to do is we need to choose to come into present time and look at that view from present time, rather than being in the past and dragging it into the present time and acting it out. Because all we'll do is just amplify the energy of it by doing that. But if we can come into the present and look at this, then we're in a much better situation to start to change the dynamics and shift the context. So a lot of emotion is linked to our temporal, like a lot of trauma is linked to a temporal perspective, like a time perspective. I'm being re-stimulated from something from the past. I got to acknowledge that from the present rather than just act it out from the past and enmesh this nasty energy or incomplete energy into the present and just recreate it again. So then I just have multiple traumas existing over multiple timelines. So because we have judged the emotion and associated situations not being okay, then our first and strongest impulse is to avoid it in some way. When we are activated with the past trauma, we rarely consider that we're being re-stimulated from a past event. For all intents and purposes, it seems that we're dealing with something that's happening now, but in truth, we're being dragged back into a past event. And then from the Course in Miracles, we're never upset for the reason that we think we are. So why would you want to go near a feeling that you now believe is bad? So why would you want to sort of sit with it and feel it if you believe it's bad? So if you judge it as being, this is a bad feeling, you'll then try and naturally come up with strategies not to sit with it and feel it and be present with it. And then blame other people and distract yourself with drugs or something, just so you don't feel it. So avoiding the emotion means that we never get close enough to it or into an opportunity to heal or integrate. So if we avoid it, it's never going to heal. So if we try not to expose ourselves to feeling that feeling, it'll never get better. So use a scenario of guilt. So someone says, oh, will you help me move house next week? You go, it's my only weekend off. I really need the downtime. And then I go, yeah, sure, I'll do it. And so the reason I'm doing it is because if I don't, I feel guilty. And so I don't want to feel guilty. So then I do all these things that deplete me and work against me because I don't want to feel that emotion. Does that make sense? So I don't do it because I care. I just don't want to feel guilty. So it's all selfish. It's all selfish, just protecting my own ass. It may look compassionate. Oh, yes, let me help you move house. They better be grateful. And then you feel resentful. Huh?
Because they were so grateful.
Yeah, but that's neither here nor there because you offered to do it. So avoiding the emotion means we never get close enough. So if I just sat there that weekend and felt guilty, it would be better than actually helping move. So if I felt like racked with guilt, I'd be operating in my best interest objectively by not going there. But then all my guilt from all the times where I compromised what I really needed for just to avoid the feeling of guilt would all surface. And I might feel terrible that whole weekend, but at least I'm not being controlled by the guilt. It's not steering me in my life. I'm starting to navigate out of that circle that I've been trapped in all my life. Does that make sense? Well, you won't feel the resentment because you didn't You only feel the resentment, the secondary emotion to the guilt. You'll just feel the guilt. You'll feel the resentment after you've helped them move house. So by judging and then avoiding the associated emotion, that emotion is stuck or blocked. This forms what we now understand as an unresolved emotional issue. So when an emotional issue persists, as they often do, we begin to compensate. What this means is that we can start to modify our natural state of being to try and accommodate the issue, which has serious consequences, including the following. So our life purpose and direction in life. So we may feel guilty because it affects others if we go for what our true passion is, because it may inconvenience those around us. If we need to avoid guilt, then we may not follow our purpose because we don't like that feeling and so avoid it. Does that make sense? Our health. When we eat a healthy diet, our body may start to detoxify, which brings up associated emotions. So when you start eating a really clean diet and stop putting toxins in your body goes, oh, thank God, I'm going to start cleaning out. And so all the chemicals, unhealthy foods that are stored in the body, residue, all start to get cleaned out. When they get cleaned out, they mobilize. So you've got to get them mobilized to get them cleaned out. As they arise, we may eat food that doesn't agree with us, so that we can stay toxic and don't have to deal with the buried emotions. So whenever you detox, your toxic emotions will come off as well. And so then when those toxic emotions come up, they're associated with the self-medication of substances and food, then you're likely, if you can't get through the emotion, the toxic emotions, and sit with them and let them move through you, then you're likely to just self-medicate again to hide those emotions. Does that make sense?
I actually said that to someone yesterday. We were talking about energy, and I'm like, yeah, that's why I stay low with my smoke and my food, because when I start lifting, when I start lifting up, I start lifting up.
Yeah, so then all your unresolved emotions will start coming up, and then you go, oh, I don't like those, and you self-medicate to lower you, to push it back down. Our structure. So when we have fear around feeling love, we may block the love so that the fear doesn't emerge, causing us to roll our shoulders and protecting or hiding the heart. So, if we what if we've been, had heart issues, we're broken-hearted for some reason, we might start to take the stance on until we're kind of protecting it physically and changes the way our structure is, because we're not resolving the emotion. We can resolve it and open our hearts again. Our structure will change. To keep us weak so that we can be controlled by authority. So, like, you're from Ireland,
yeah.
Catholic, yeah, Catholic guilt, right? So all of Europe was controlled by the church, and the way they did it was through guilt. So Jesus died for your sins. So you live a miserable, sacrificial life, and when you're dead, you can be with Jesus in heaven. So what that did was, it just, and that was a misinterpretation of the story of Jesus, which we can go into, but we'll do that another time. But that was just a strategy to keep people guilty, and so when you're guilty, you're piss weak, and so you're easy to control and dominate.
Even when you see a mom conflict with child,
but it's still there. We haven't even healed it.
Exactly.
It's not. It hasn't been healed. So even though people have turned away from the church, en masse, in the last sort of 50 to 100, well, probably the last 200 years, it's been steering away from it. But even though people have turned away from the church, they haven't dealt with emotion. because they were trained to suppress it. And then now they use multimedia to distract people from their pain. So rather than deal with that old pain, we now just distract them with all these entertainment devices. So that old pain is still very relevant, even though the structures around it are broken down. And so then now we've got sort of medieval pain still in our hearts, and we're distracted from that by looking at our phones, and then they're putting in all sorts of new control structures now, they're all based on fear. Anyway, don't get me started. So, resolving emotion. So, in my opinion, and also like the health system. The health system goes, oh, poor darling, you're having fear, have some antidepressants, or have some anxiety medication. So there's a lack of interest in actually digging deeper and finding causes. There's an interest in superficial, and then you've got the vested interest of big pharma and things like that, treating governments, blah blah blah. It just goes on and on. But it's all about control, and we all have the choice to tap into our own power. We all have the choice to step out of it as individuals. And we can't really blame those structures. We can only blame ourselves for choosing to stay in them. And so, at least with you guys, like kinesiology, you'll be able to provide the framework for people to step out of these control structures and start to tune into the spirit to orientate themselves. So resolving emotion, in my opinion, it is my opinion that humans in general are shockers at resolving emotional issues. By and large, this underpins our inability to ever reach our potential as individuals or as a species. So our whole culture reflects inability to resolve emotional issues. However, there is an increasing propensity to enable compensation, resulting from holding on to our traumas. So compensation is what you do when you can't resolve something. You compensate. So I can't resolve my guilt, so then I just help people at my own detriment and feel resentment toward them. And so that's how I compensate. So what needs to be emphasized here is that for every emotional trauma we hold, a portion of our life force is reassigned away from our potential and used up in holding the issue in place. So I think I said last time that an emotional issue, holding an emotional stress is an active process. It's not a passive process. If we were passive, it would just resolve itself, but we're actively holding it in place. So we've created all these structures we're not even aware of that keeps these things in place. So with every emotional issue we hold on to, the efficiency of our mind and our body is compromised. Reducing our operating potential, our neurology becomes cluttered, our breath constricts, our unresolved emotional trauma imprint into each and every cell, recording into our DNA to be passed on to future generations. We can also miss our children. Interestingly, resolving an emotional trauma is a passive process, while holding an emotional trauma is an active process. Simply feeling the feeling as it arises and being present with it will enable the resolution. When we are present and don't react, then the body's intelligence kicks in and the issue is metabolized by the body mind. The key way to kind of resolve any emotion is just to be present with it, and not, because as soon as you have an emotion arise and you go, oh, I don't like that, how do I fix it? The need to fix it is a compensation, because you've already judged it as being not okay, and you fix it. You see how that works? So as soon as they go, oh, I feel angry, that's not okay. How can I fix it? Then I've already judged it, and so I've held it in place. So it's tricky.
Crying. I'm like, I'm so emotional and I'm judging it. And I'm like, well, you know you're judging it. Stop.
Well, that's like, learned behavior. That, yeah. Well, it's good that you're mindful about that and making choices to stop it.
That must
I really probably only had a handful of like really powerful experiences where I've been able to just go, just feel, just feel, just embrace, just feel. And each of them has been profound where I just done that. Where I haven't tried to like maneuver my mind in a way to try and get rid of this because I don't like it. But when I've done it, it's been absolutely